Hello, and welcome to another edition of U.S.-Japan Council's Japanese American and Japan Legacies video series. I'm Deborah Nakatomi, and Diane Fukami and I are your hosts for this series of dialogues highlighting the lives and journeys of prominent Japanese American leaders, each of them pioneers in developing the U.S.-Japan relationship. Through their stories, we will learn about the role of Japanese Americans in strengthening U.S.-Japan relations and ways in which their experiences with Japan have contributed to their Japanese American identity and our community. We'd like to thank the U.S.-Japan Council for providing this opportunity to share their unique and powerful stories. We would also like to thank our friends at Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs for their invaluable support of this program and of Japanese American leaders to nurture the U.S.-Japan relationship. Today, we welcome James Higa, Managing Partner, Offline Ventures, Executive Director of Philanthropic Ventures Foundation, and USJC Board Member. Welcome, James. Very nice to see you.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see you.
Well, we are so excited to explore your story today. You've had such an interesting early life, which I'm sure really shaped a lot of who you've become. Born in the US, leaving at the age of 2, with your family to go to Okinawa and then returning back to Oregon, I think in 3rd grade. So please tell us about those early memories of your life.
Well, I think, one thing, as you mentioned, going back and forth, and it may seem like a trivial thing, but I learned pretty early on that the world is a bigger place. And it's a seemingly simple, but I think a deeply profound lesson. I remember going back to Indiana when I was 8 because my parents wanted all the kids to eventually study in the US and go to university here. And so we did that. And to this day, I have this recollection of landing in Indiana and having the people there, come over, I think it was at a church, and ask me, is it really true that in Okinawa, in Japan, people don't eat with knives and forks? And I said, yes, that's true. But, to realize that, oh, it's not the same all over the world. And people do things here differently. There are lots of different ways to think about how to approach life and the world around them. I learned at a pretty early age.
So tell us a little bit about your family's background. Okay, so and also clarify for me. So born in Indiana, you go back to the family goes to Okinawa, where your parents are from, back to Indiana again. Give us a little timeline here as how old you are and what that was like.
That happened because my parents both survived the Battle of Okinawa. And they both decided to go overseas and study abroad, taking into advantage a goodwill scholarship for people from Okinawa to study in the United States. But it was a rare person who did that. I mean, why would you do that? My mother, for instance, all of her immediate family, most of, other than her brother and younger sister and extended family, were killed during the Battle of Okinawa by US Marines. So why would you go jump and fly into the heart of the enemy that destroyed and killed everything that you hold dear and love? But my parents wanted to take that opportunity. And because they had that, they wanted for their children to have an education in the US, which they thought at that time would be better for us than in Japan. And so I was born in Indiana. When I was 2, we went back to Okinawa, and I was in regular Japanese school, elementary school, till about the 3rd grade. And my parents realized English ain't taking root. We have to do something. They sold off everything. We moved back to Indiana. And eventually, my mother landed a job teaching Japanese, at the Department of Defense school, which is like the public school on base. That's why we went back. to Okinawa. But the lesson for me and all that back and forth was really my mother should have been filled with hate and rage against the US and folks who had really made her lose all the things that were dear to her. But what happened was, as I was growing up in Okinawa, our house was constantly having Fulbright professors come through, or students from the US, or people from the military base. We have a street in Okinawa called the International Street, Kokusai Dori, and our house was like that. And the lesson for me was that love triumphs over hate. And I saw that with my parents in their lives and what they did. It should have been hate, but they turned and used love to try to make a difference in the world. And that's the lesson that I learned in what seemed like chaotic young life.
All right, so let's
And
go
it
back
also,
to.
oh, I'm sorry. Go
I
ahead.
want to go back for a moment to that more contemporary picture of James and his family, his wife and his children. So those lessons, how did they influence the way you parented and brought up your kids, James? And if we can show that photo
Sure.
again, that would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, I've tried to pass on the same things to our children that I consider the greatest gifts my parents gave me, which is one, to try to teach them that the world is a bigger place. Our son was born in Japan, in Tokyo, and grew up there, as was our daughter. And then we moved back here to the US. And that is, the world is a bigger place. And let's give you a global perspective, as well as the other gift, which is I can't thank my parents enough for raising me to be truly bicultural. And I've certainly tried that with our family of both speaking the languages, Japanese and English, but being bicultural and understanding their roots, their heritage, the culture in a much deeper way.
So you go to high school in Okinawa, and then you decide to come back to the U.S. Talk, and you go to Stanford. So talk a little bit about the impact and the transition of being a high school student. Here you're playing basketball at high school in Okinawa, right?
Yes.
And then adjusting to Stanford, which I'm sure is really different.
Well, I mean, it was quite different because coming all the way from Okinawa to be there was certainly a challenge. I mean, it's a long way away from home. But, upon reflection, I think one of the things as part of that journey that I really felt was that at Stanford, I met a lot of fellow Japanese Americans, Asian Americans. And at the time, they all wanted to get into Unipero, which was the Japanese theme house, where Professor Okimoto actually was the resident fellow. And they were trying to discover their identity because many of them were sansei, yonsei, etc. And I could not relate to that because for me, the question was, what are you talking about? I mean, I don't need to discover my Japanese-ness. I grew up in Japan. I went to school in Japan. I watched Japanese TV. And when I was in Japan, the ironic thing was that when people would ask me, and my parents would be around, are you Japanese? My parents are always saying, no, you're not Japanese, you're Okinawan. And so there, I'm trying to figure out how to be Okinawan. And the Stanford experience was really more about my trying to find my Americanness, if you will, because it was really the first time to be living in the US after I was 18. And so I think it was about what we all go through in our hero's journey. We all have to find a way to our identity. And it's a different journey for all of us. For me, the Japanese American part actually came much later, I would say, with the USJC. as I began to overlay more of that into the identity of who I am. But in today's world, if we look at the current generation, it's a very complicated, mixed, and multifaceted identity that we all bring to the table. And we all have to go through our individual journeys to find that person who is you.
Yeah. So James, I want you to delve a little bit more into that journey as a young person. You were at Stanford and you shared with us this rather cool photo in your, I think it was your Stanford days, and it was probably the beginning of your photography exploration. And there's a picture here of two of you with a camera. So tell us about that time in your life as you were exploring this, what was going to later be your passion of photography.
Well, Stanford and photography, or photography, was actually both a passion and a very practical means, meaning that's how I was able to pay for my tuition. And that picture was myself and a fellow photographer on the football field. I became very quickly the photography editor of the student newspaper because I came from Okinawa. I was the only one with all the fancy equipment and the big lenses to be able to take the photos at a football game. And so I got to do the thing that I love, taking sports photographs of football, volleyball, soccer, etc. And that was a hell of a lot better than working in the library or working in the cafeteria. But in a very practical sense, it's how I earned money to be able to pay for my tuition by reselling my photograph to the athletic department, to local newspapers, to sports magazines, etc.
So in addition to photography being your means to get you through school, very practical, I know that you reflected also when we spoke about how you found photography and what influenced you to find photography, what attracted you, because I know that there's kind of this artistic, aesthetic piece to it as well. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, well, it's two things. It was handed down from our dad. And so myself and my two younger brothers, we all picked up the camera. My mom hated it because every weekend we would take over the laundry room with smelly chemicals and enlargers, and she couldn't get the laundry done. But photography attracts me in a number of ways. One, it speaks to the nerd in me. It's all about the latest technical breakthroughs in equipment and cameras. So there is certainly that. But I think more than that, it really teaches you to pay attention to detail. You really have to look at the world in a unique way and try to pay attention and slow down and look at things deeply. But also it forces you to have a point of view, meaning you have to be able to show people this is how I see the world, which is different than maybe you see it. Right now during COVID, I do my morning walks, and the only thing I can take pictures of around my neighborhood is flowers and plants along curbsides and yards. But again, photography forces me to pay attention and look at the little flowers that normally I never looked at. And it forces me to try to interpret that and show it in a way that makes other people take notice and sit up with the fact that, oh, James sees things differently. That's very interesting. So both technically and intellectually and emotionally, it really speaks to me.
I'm going to hold on to that because I know we'll revisit that later on in our discussion, because I think that point of view, that unique point of view, we're going to come back to. So I want to focus on your career a bit. You've had quite the career adventure over 30 plus years. And I know that you spent a good part of your career at Apple until about 2012. And what we're really interested to talk about today is, what did you learn from those experiences that you probably couldn't have learned other places? And what did you take away from those years?
Well, one thing I learned is that business, if you will, is not necessarily about ROI and the bottom line. And I say that because the time at Apple, for us, it was not about being a $1 trillion company. We had no idea it was ever going to be this large. It was not about trying to be Microsoft and Bill Gates. It wasn't about kind of the profit imperative. What we were trying to do was trying to change the world. And the best way we knew how to do that was to create what we thought of as the best tool humankind has had to date, called the personal computer. And maybe if we did that, and we did that to the best of our abilities, we could change the way that people live, the way people work, the way that we study, the way that we are informed, that way that we are entertained. And in many ways, I would argue now, in reflection, that we did change the world in that way. The $1 trillion company and the profits came later. I mean, it came as a result of us having to pursue the passion and the motivation to try to build these tools that we thought could make a difference in the world. And that's certainly one thing that I learned during my time at Apple.
So drilling down just a little bit more about some of the skills, the experiences that have really shaped who you've become, and certainly the work that you continue to do. What are some of those experiences that you practice today that continue to influence your work and your life?
Yeah. Well, if I could make one more point about
Sure.
kind of lesson that I learned there, I think is that you can push against the universe and make a dent in it. And that means that you can have ideas and you can have things that are in your mind that you want to bring into the world and give it birth. And it's possible to make that happen and give your ideas life in the world. It was things like we really, really wanted to transform the computer from a text interface to something that had a graphical user interface. And we were able to do that. But it wasn't easy. It was very difficult. And things like iTunes were also very difficult. Everybody around us said Apple has no business being in the business of music. And we could never convince the record labels to agree to downloading music off the internet. But we were able to work hard and push against the universe and make that happen. And it takes a lot of work, and it ain't easy, and it takes a lot of fortitude. And most people think of Apple as just up and to the right and success upon success upon success. It was not like that at all. At one point, every week I was reading an article about how someone would buy Apple, whether it would be Sony or Motorola or some microsystems, because there is no way you guys, Luke Skywalker in the little fighter plane, is ever going to beat what we thought of as the Death Star of Microsoft, who could outspend us, out-hire us, out-logistics us. And if many of you know the journey of Steve Jobs going from Apple, getting thrown out of Apple to Next Computer, and then back to Cupertino, when we had to leave Apple, we felt like we weren't even 30 yet, but the world was telling us we had failed. You don't have anything. And we felt like, but we do. And it was a really, really difficult time. So overcoming all those hardships and struggles is part of pushing against that universe and trying to make something a reality. And a lot of people ask me, how could you ever have worked for someone like Steve? Isn't he a perfectionist? And isn't he such a hard driver? And isn't he a tyrant? And we didn't look at it that way because we wanted to push against that universe as badly as he did. We wanted that perfection. We wanted to build these things that were in our hearts. And so at the end of every project, my feeling was typically, thank you for pushing me, because I didn't know I had that in me. And can I have another? And could you make that next challenge even bigger and even harder?
Which sort of speaks to the business success that you've become. Early in your career at Apple, you had said that one of the things that you looked as a company and as a group that you would look toward was sort of the success of Japanese companies, and that back in the day there were key Japanese companies that seemed to be this model of success. Talk a little bit about your experience working in the US and Japan and how that shaped your views both back then and also now.
Well, one thing that it did teach me, and we had very close relationships with companies like Sony and with Canon. That's a picture of Steve and my wife and Lisa with Dr. Yamaji, who was CEO of Canon at the time. But one thing I learned is that there is no monopoly on genius or entrepreneurship. It's really strange for me to look at the world today when everybody, including those of you in Japan, look to the US for inspiration, and you want to be the entrepreneurs that Steve Jobs is, or Mark Zuckerberg is, or Larry and Sergey, or Jeff Bezos. But we look to Japan. The entrepreneurs and great leaders that we aspire to become someday were folks like Morita at Sony and Matsushita at Panasonic and Honda at Honda. Someday we wanted to grow up and be the entrepreneurs that they were, because they built iconic global brands out of the rubble of World War II. They are amazing, amazing leaders and entrepreneurs. And so I learned to, again, see the world in a bigger way, in a bigger place, with bigger talent in many, many places, and learned that in a very, very personal way on that journey. And some of those lessons that, maybe we could talk about that they taught us, as well as, the things that I took away from Apple. And, one of them is this notion of radical collaboration. All the great things that I've worked on have been a product of what I consider radical collaboration. And an example of that is the Susan Kare in the original Mac group. Susan is a graphic designer. And when she landed in the development group, everybody is thinking, what is going on? Like, she's not a programmer, she's not an engineer, she's just a graphic designer. But the Macintosh desktop, as we know it today, and much of the iPhone interface that inherited that, came as a result of Susan hand drawing the interface as we know it today, with the trash can in the corner and the folders and the pull down menus. And the engineers had to go kind of figure out how to do that. We actually also had a musician on the development team, and it was many decades away before a computer could actually play full fidelity music. But we felt that it was important to have that point of view and that cognitive diversity on the team. And that notion of very radical collaboration, diverse skills, cognitive points of view and diversity is still with me today.
So you're working as a consultant with some very successful companies. Talk a little bit about the work that you're currently doing and how you choose to work with the companies that you choose to.
So I have two general filters in life, and they are don't work with A asterisk holes and work on S asterisk IT that matters. And I try to apply that to all things I do. And it's seemingly simple, but it's very powerful. And so I apply that and I think about that when I take on advisory work, and I get asked, so much that I have to really put a filter on it. And when I really think about it, I am, no matter how you think about it, on the downslope of life. I only have a certain number of minutes left on that downslope. And so that's why I really do want to work on things that matter. And I don't want to waste my minutes. And that means working with and for leaders and companies that I really do think can transform the world. Examples of that are some of the Japanese companies that I've worked with are Uniqlo and Lawson's. And the reason for that was, yes, they have very progressive leaders. And yes, they are on the verge of becoming, or have been already, or are iconic global brands.
Tell us what we're looking at here, James.
Yeah.
That is a picture of me and Yanai-san, who's the CEO of Uniqlo, when he was showing me their new headquarters that he had built in the Odaiba area in Tokyo. But the reason I wanted to work with Yanai-san is that there were a number of companies who I felt were companies and leaders of action during the Tohoku disasters. And Uniqlo moved before the government moved, before people moved. Heat tech was one of the most sought after clothing after the disasters there. Lawson's set up portable produce and grocery stores so that people could have fresh food. And Takninami, who's now with Suntory, but he was with Lawson's at the time. And that's the reason I wanted to work with these leaders. They were leaders of action. They were leaders of companies that were great companies, but also transformational in what they were trying to do to give back to society, going back to the it's not just an ROI talk that we had earlier.
So James, in your work and your life, you've certainly been able to have kind of a front row seat with so many important changes, both technologically as well as in business. And you've been a colleague with many great leaders. And as you reflect back, who have been some of your mentors and some of your greatest influences that have helped to shape your work as well as your worldview and the work that you do?
The obvious answers would be folks like Steve Jobs and Morita and Dr. Yamaji, Kodera-san at Sony. But I'm a contrarian thinker, so I'm going to give you a contrarian answer. And two things that have kind of inspired me. And one is beauty. Beauty matters and design matters. The Please Please that Issey Miyake created is beautiful to me. The lobby of the Sogetsu Kaikan in Aoyama that Isamu Noguchi created is unbelievably beautiful. And I used to go and sit there for 1 or 2 hours just looking at what he had created. Let's see here, the Mira Tower that Jeannie Gang, hello to all the Chicago USJC members. She's my current favorite US architect. Is an unbelievably beautiful edifice in San Francisco. And, you know, at Apple, we always thought of ourselves as the company that needed to be at the intersection of technology and the liberal arts. And we meant liberal arts in its widest sense of the humanistic movement that came out of the Middle Ages and the printing press, which gave each of us the ability to read the Bible and interpret it on our own versus via the church. And the intersection of the liberal arts is about bringing those beautiful things, the liberal arts, combining it with technology into the world. You know, an example of that is we love fonts, just beautiful fonts, in Helvetica and Times Roman and Baskerville. And it was because of our love of these fonts that when we were working on the Macintosh, we couldn't help ourselves. What we wanted to do was ask the question, why is it that you cannot display on a computer screen these beautiful things that we've come to love? And that's the question that drove us to look at things like the bitmap technology for screens that was under development at Xerox PARC and work so hard to create the user interface that would make that possible. So beauty inspires us, and to me has been a real important mentor, if you will.
So I want to introduce one more finding that as we were doing our research, I know that you are a lover and a great appreciator of haiku. And the way that you've just described the aesthetic that you seek.
Can I mention one more? Can I mention one more influence, which I was going to do, which is the women of the Macintosh group. And in the early days in the Macintosh group, we had this kind of informal kind of poll award of who stood up to Steve the best. And invariably, it was the amazing women of the Macintosh group. Suzanne Barnes was the CFO. Debbie Coleman, who ran the Macintosh factory. And Barb Culkin, who ran marketing. And Joanna Hoffman, who's as close to a polymath as I've known and know today. And I feel like most of what I've learned about management comes from having learned and having seen these women. And
I love that you're saying this.
Well, but it's also very shocking to me that in the history of the Macintosh group or Apple, these are all very untold stories. Mm-hmm. And it needs to be told, I believe. But they were very inspirational for me, but more than that, truly, as I said, I really learned the most fundamental things about how to be not just a great manager, but a great person from my colleagues there.
Like what specifically though, James?
I think it's just a lot of things. I mean, they were strong, you know, to say, no, here's what I believe, you're wrong. Here's what the factory ought to do, or here's what the product ought to look like, or the marketing campaign needs to be X, Y, Z. So I learned how to translate that point of view into a strong voice in a way that can compel and in a way that can move people and convince people. I learned a lot about voracious curiosity, talking about Joanna Hoffman. And voracious curiosity is really, really important in the world because innovation happens at the edge of unreasonableness. You have to get to an unreasonable place in order to create and in order to innovate. And in order to get to that edge of the cliff, you must have voracious curiosity. And Joanna and I would talk about things, everything. She was a physics major, but also about fonts and calligraphy, about the Renaissance, about Japanese design. And you have to have that. And that's one of the things I learned. An example of unreasonableness is I've also worked with the Joe Gebbia at Airbnb for many years. And Airbnb, it was a completely unreasonable, if not a crazy idea. If you look at their first pitch deck, which is probably somewhere on the internet, the idea for Airbnb was there's a design conference in San Francisco. I'm gonna buy and blow up an air mattress and have somebody pay to sleep on it. That's where the air in air bed and breakfast Airbnb comes from. And that's why they got, I think, something like 70 no's before they got their first yes. It is a completely out there on the edge idea that makes no sense. But these are the unreasonable ideas at the edge of the cliff that you have to pay attention to, because that's when you can look down over the cliff and see the land of innovation. And that's something that I learned from these women.
Well, I love that you've given a big kudos to the women who have influenced you. I think that's so important. And you've included them as mentors who have had great influence in your life and your work, which is really important. I'm sure that they haven't gotten their due over time, right? As the story has been told. So
yeah,
I do want to go
other
back.
women who contributed to computation and personal computing.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I still want to go back to that haiku question because that
Sure.
fascinated me. That you are a practitioner, you appreciate it, you have spent some years along with your wife, right? So tell us about that connection that you've had to haiku.
Haiku speaks to me in two ways. One is that it is about the art of subtraction. You only have 15 syllables. And so you have to really strip away everything down to its essence. And that's true of product design as well. And it is a Japanese Zen aesthetic, if you will, of how do you take away something and keep taking it away till you get down to the essence, the crystal clear clarity of the idea that you have for a product or a design. This is the notion of there's no power button on the iPod, as an example. Nobody questions why you needed one in the first place. So the stripping away element certainly speaks to me with haiku, and it teaches you a lot. The other reason that it really speaks to me is that it's very much like programming, which is what you want to do is in the smallest amount of space, characters, bits, if you will. In haiku, you're trying to communicate the most complexity that you can about how you feel, how you see the world, but through that, how you feel about it and how you interpret humanity's existence in the world. You have to really communicate that complex emotion through a seemingly a very trivial detail. And it's the same with programming, which is how do you most elegantly, in the least amount of bits, text, do the most complicated amount of tasks. So there's actually quite a lot in common between the digital realm of programming and software and the analog realm of haiku poetry.
And I've never
James,
heard that connection before. So thank you. Thank you for that.
That's
you've had
curious, voracious curiosity.
You've had such an unconventional life compared to so many of Japanese Americans who were born and raised in the mainland, a big risk guy. Your parents encouraged you to do a lot of things. A Renaissance man. So many of us were told to go to college and major in one thing and be successful in that one thing. And you were sort of allowed to be yourself. Talk about being a big risk guy. Was that part of your makeup? Is that something that you explored on your own? Where does that come from? And how can other people become bigger risk takers?
I would say part of it comes from having been in the underdog situation all my life. I think whether it was you're going to the US, you don't know any English, we're going to drop you into kindergarten and good luck. Or whether it's you're going to create a computer and go up against IBM, seemingly not possible. Or whether it's, my parents there in the photograph believing in me that I could get into a university like Stanford when all my teachers in high school said, don't even think about it because no one from our school has ever gotten in. And I think I just didn't have a rear view mirror because I was too busy being put in these situations to really think about what could have been or should have been or in my past. And I think it's a very important kind of value to have, which is don't dwell on the past. You can't make it any different. And even if you've had great success, stop patting yourself on your back. You really need to be present and figure out what it is that you can do and contribute going forward. So I think, that has helped, but I would phrase the question a little bit differently. At least I interpret it differently because I've never thought of these things as risks. I've always thought of it more as I've wanted to do something so badly to bring forth these ideas, to put that beautiful font on the computer screen, to be able to enjoy all the music in the world and have it on my phone. I can't help myself. It's more that it's not a risk. It's I want to see this in the world so badly. It's the motivation to make that happen is stronger. And that's what lets you overcome adversity. And that's a much, much bigger driver than what is the risk or what might possibly be the consequences of failure. It's not risk, it's opportunity.
You're driven by passion. Yeah.
So I want to take that a little bit further, connecting, this continuum of James, Stanford photographer, all of your experience in tech, certainly, business consultant, investor, which is part of the work you're doing now with Offline Ventures. But you've also really made philanthropy a really important part of your current work. So going back to Diane's question, expanding a bit more about that mindset and that motivation, because I know, and I've heard you speak about this before, about the desire that you have to make an impact in the lives of people. And I've heard you talk about betting on people and making investment in people. So talk about what motivated you to really enter philanthropy in such a significant way, and what's that dent in the universe that you're trying to make there?
Yeah, part of it I think has a start with the story of love triumphing over hate that I saw in the example of my mother and father. But also, it was through my journey at Apple, if you think about it, it was the most amazing place to work. I had all the perks anyone could ever want, a cafeteria overflowing with abundant food. I could get my car washed in the parking lot. I could drop my laundry off in the lobby and have it done. And yet, 2 blocks away, there were children going hungry. And there were mothers whose only wish was to have a decent education for their children. And mothers and fathers whose only hope was a shot at a dignified job. And this is what I've come to think of as the 2 block gap. This 2 block gap of the inequality of opportunity is socially, I think, the most defining issue of our generation. And it behooves all of us to not ignore that, but to try to do something about it. And so that's my motivation for doing the philanthropic work, which is, how do I close this 2 block gap? And how can I do it not through products and technologies so much as through people and through communities?
So give us some examples of some of the work you're doing at Philanthropic Ventures around your term radical collaboration, as well as some of the practices that you've brought into that space. Because philanthropy is, we've had these conversations before, is changing really rapidly, and there's a lot of pressure to break out and radically change the way philanthropy has operated for decades. So how are you making a difference in the work that you're doing at Philanthropic Ventures?
Well, I'll give you a more recent example that came about from, well, I'll give you 2 examples. One is during COVID, we learned that our food supply chain is very fragile. And Eat, Learn, Play was an organization, a nonprofit in Oakland, that wanted to reopen Oakland restaurants, not so that people could come eat at the restaurants, but so they could reopen and make meals for first responders, for elderly people who can't go out, for children who don't have their free lunch program anymore. And I thought it was a really interesting idea. Not only is it impactfully good immediately to get these meals to people who need it, but also a bet on maybe this is the way our food supply chain should work post-COVID, meaning it should be local in the Oakland community, it should be decentralized, and it should be circular, giving back to the community, versus the big box kind of mass manufacturing, mass consumption supply chains, and hospitals or schools writing the catering contract through an RFP to the lowest bidder in the country, who maybe happen to be in another state. And I think that's a notion of both, radical outlook, but a radical collaboration of a nonprofit idea, local restaurants, foundations that can support it. They reached out to World Central Kitchen, so the spreading web of collaboration. Another is out of Black Lives Matter, the movement, and Aurora James is a well-known person in the fashion industry, model. She's been on many television shows. She has a private brand of clothing, and she really wanted to try to figure out how to approach brands like Sephora and Macy's with the notion of taking a pledge that 15% of all their products will come from Black-owned businesses. And all their vendor and service agreements, 15% would come from Black-owned businesses as well. But she had no idea how to do this. And one of the things we've done at PVF, Philanthropic Ventures Foundation, is the nonprofit as a service model, so that startups and companies and folks like Aurora, without having to launch their own 501c3, can just have a fund with us. And we do all the overhead, we do all the admin, we write the checks, the taxes, audits, roll up under us, etc. So Aurora was able to get 15% pledge up and going in 2 weeks. And she signed up a who's who of retailers and companies. So that's another example of what I consider to be kind of this notion of radical collaboration within the field.
Yeah, those are great examples. Thank you.
James, I'm going to turn to another area of interest of yours,
Sure.
which is bridging the entrepreneurial connections between US and Japan. Now, I know that you're a member of USJC and have been a pretty integral part of it. I know that Dr. Dan Okimoto recruited you to join USJC. But right now, your primary focus has been really Silicon Valley Japan platform. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that intertwines and how Japanese Americans have made a difference in that effort?
Yeah, sure. Japan and the US, and especially Silicon Valley, have always been intertwined. We work with Sony and the Trinitron monitor to put it into Macintosh computers. We work with Canon on the laser printer. And there were always people who were the bridge. In my generation, there were folks like my colleagues, Guy Kawasaki and Keith Yamashita, as an example. And the question is, how do we continue to create that connection and the bonds for this generation and going forward? And SVJP is a way to do that, the Silicon Valley Japan platform. And we connect Japanese companies whom you all know and love, and hello to our corporate members who are tuning in from Japan. We try to connect them with the best thinkers, leaders, innovative companies in the Valley, which is very difficult to do because Silicon Valley is a really closed insider network, and getting access to the top tier kind of networks is very difficult. And also, what we are trying to do is to connect the best entrepreneurs coming out of Japan. And in the SVJP, we have the great entrepreneurial companies of Japan, the Money Forward, the Mercari, the Luxos, and connecting them with founders, CEOs, designers in Silicon Valley. An example of that is the design and food trip that I've led 3 times now. It's limited to a very small number of people, CEOs, founders, designers, usually about 10 people. And we go to Japan, not as a tourist trip, but to learn about the influences in design and in aesthetics, etc., that truly influenced Apple in such significant ways in Japan. So that's why when we go there, we meet with folks like Yunai-san at Uniqlo. We have met with the design team at Muji on these trips. On the last trip, we met with my favorite contemporary photographer, Hiroshi Sugimoto. And I guess the food component is the tourist part, but everybody knows me, I'm a foodie. We have to put that component in. But that's another example of how we are trying to build that bond and that connection.
It sounds like real hardship duty, James.
Somebody's got to do it.
So, for Japanese Americans for a long time have not been well respected in Japan, but more recently have gained a measure of respect. Can you talk a little bit about how you see that happening now, especially in the Silicon Valley area?
Yeah, I think, I don't know, I mean, in my journey, it's Japanese Americans have been kind of part of the fabric of
Maybe you're too
Silicon
young
Valley.
then, you know?
And, but you do raise a point, which is, I think there is now kind of much stronger renewed interest, as we've seen even in the political social situations, about reflecting back upon the Japanese American internment experience and what it means really in a much larger way, which you two have been working on in terms of freedom and in terms of liberation, but also a renewed look back at the importance that Japan and the US and that relationship, certainly for Silicon Valley, has been significant. And there was a period where it felt like it's been bypassed because everything was about manufacturing in China, et cetera. And the pendulum is really swinging back to reevaluate, reflect on, and renew those bonds, which means a reflection of the people who have created those bonds, which means, oh, look at all these Japanese Americans who played such key roles post-war through the fourth industrial information revolution that we've come to know as Silicon Valley.
The one thing I want to mention and also give you great credit for is the time that you spend with the Emerging Leaders Program, because this entrepreneurial spirit and this vast experience that you have needs to be transferred, whether it's the spirit and the risk-taking and this kind of voracious curiosity that you have. Those are all traits that I think are really going to really help to build that foundational vision for young people to seek those kinds of careers and really expand beyond the tradition. So thank you for all the time that you spend with the USJC Leaders Program, because I know that it's really valuable. Yeah. I think we're just about coming up on our time here. We want to thank you very, very much, James, for your time today, and also taking a moment to kind of expand our view and vision of you. I've learned a lot in this conversation, and we want to thank you for your candor and sharing so many great stories about your experience. So thank you very much. And we want to thank our viewers as well. Your support of the U.S.-Japan Council and all of the programs have really enabled USJC to continue to bring high-quality programs like this interview that you've just seen today. And we hope you've enjoyed the dialogue. We hope you'll check out the others in the series. They're available on USJC's website and also on the YouTube channel. So thank you again for joining us.